I never thought I would become the neighborhood villain for letting snow sit on my boat cover. But here I am, locked in a battle with the most vindictive HOA president in all of Colorado Springs, and I am absolutely loving every second of it. My name is Marcus Henderson, and I have lived in the Pineview Ridge community for 3 years now. It is one of those planned developments where every house looks nearly identical. The lawns must be kept at exactly 2.5 inches, and apparently, God forbid you let Mother Nature do her thing on your property. I bought my place because it had a nice driveway, a decent garage, and most importantly, it was close to Lake Pueblo where I could take my fishing boat out on weekends. The boat was my pride and joy, a 22-foot Ranger base boat that I had saved up for years to afford. I kept it parked on the side of my house, properly covered with a quality boat cover, completely within the property lines. Everything was fine until this past January when we got hit with a decent snowstorm. Nothing crazy by Colorado standards, just about 8 inches overnight. I woke up that Saturday morning, made myself some coffee, and looked out the window at the fresh blanket of white covering everything. It was beautiful. My boat cover had a nice pile of snow on top of it, which would melt off in a day or two like it always did. I had more pressing concerns, like shoveling my driveway and making sure my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, could get to her car. I spent most of that morning helping Mrs. Patterson and clearing my own driveway. By the time I was done, I was exhausted and cold. I went inside, took a hot shower, and settled in to watch some college basketball. That is when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a woman I had seen around the neighborhood but never actually spoken to. She was probably in her late 40s, with that aggressive blonde bob haircut that seemed to be standard issue for a certain type of suburban woman. She was wearing a puffy North Face jacket and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Are you Marcus Henderson?" She demanded, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Yeah, that is me. I am Barbara Whitmore, president of the Pineview Ridge HOA. I need to talk to you about your boat." I glanced over at my boat, still covered in snow, sitting exactly where it had been for 3 years. "What about it?" "The snow," she said, gesturing dramatically toward it. "It is a violation of our community standards. Section 12. Subsection 4 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that all property must be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion. That includes removing snow accumulation from recreational vehicles and equipment within 48 hours of snowfall." I stared at her. "You are joking." "I most certainly am not. I will be issuing you a formal violation notice. You have 72 hours to remove the snow and bring your property into compliance, or you will face a fine of $100 per day." "It is going to melt on its own in like 2 days," I said. "It is supposed to be 50 degrees by Monday." "That is irrelevant. The bylaws are clear. 48 hours. She handed me a printed notice from her clipboard. "Have a nice day, Mr. Henderson." She turned and walked away before I could even respond. I stood there holding this ridiculous piece of paper, completely dumbfounded. I had lived here for 3 years and had gotten through multiple winters without anyone saying a word about snow on my boat cover. This was insane. I called my buddy Derek that evening and told him what happened. Derek had been my friend since college and was now a lawyer, though he practiced family law, not HOA disputes. "Dude, that is absolutely ridiculous," Derek said. "But unfortunately, HOAs can be pretty aggressive about enforcement. You should check your bylaws. You have a copy." I did have a copy, somewhere in a box in my garage with all my closing documents. I had never actually read them because, honestly, who reads that stuff? I spent that evening digging through boxes until I found the thick packet of HOA documents. I flipped through page after page of mind-numbing rules about fence heights, paint colors, and landscaping requirements. Finally, I found section 12. Derek was right to tell me to check, because when I read subsection 4 carefully, I realized Barbara was completely twisting the language. The rule said that properties must be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion, and it did mention snow removal from walkways and driveways for safety reasons. But there was absolutely nothing specific about boat covers or any time frame about recreational vehicles. Barbara was interpreting this rule in the most absurd way possible. I decided to ignore the notice. The snow would melt and this whole thing would blow over. I was wrong. Monday morning, the snow had indeed started melting. By Tuesday, my boat cover was completely clear. I thought that was the end of it. Then, on Friday, I got another notice in my mailbox. This one informed me that I had failed to comply with the initial violation notice and was now being fined $100 per day, retroactive to when the 72-hour window expired. According to their math, I now owed $400. I was furious. I immediately called the HOA office and asked to speak with Barbara. The woman who answered, who sounded much nicer than Barbara, told me that Barbara was not available but that I could attend the next HOA board meeting to dispute the fine. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7. I marked it on my calendar and spent the weekend preparing my arguments. I printed out the relevant section of the bylaws, highlighted the parts that proved Barbara was overreaching, and even took photos of my boat with the completely clear cover to show that the problem had resolved itself naturally. Tuesday evening came, and I drove over to the community center where the HOA meetings were held. The room was set up with a table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for residents. There were maybe 10 other people there, most of them older residents who probably attended every meeting out of boredom or civic duty. Barbara sat at the center of the table, flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized one of them, a retired guy named Tom who lived 3 streets over and always waved when I drove by. The others I had seen around but did not know personally. Barbara called the meeting to order and went through the usual boring stuff about community finances and upcoming events. Finally, she got to violations and fines. "We have one resident here tonight to dispute a fine," she announced, looking directly at me. "Mr. Henderson, would you like to come forward and state your case?" I walked up to the front trying to keep my cool. "Thanks for letting me speak. I received a violation notice about snow on my boat cover, and I want to dispute the fine because I do not believe I actually violated any rule. I have read Section 12, subsection 4 of the bylaws, and nowhere does it specifically mention boat covers or any 48-hour time frame for snow removal from recreational vehicles." I handed Barbara my printed copy with the highlighted sections. She glanced at it briefly and set it down. "Mr. Henderson, the board interprets the maintenance standards to include all visible property, including boat covers. The accumulation of snow presents an unsightly appearance that degrades the overall aesthetic of our community. But it melted naturally within a few days, just like it does on everyone's roofs and bushes and everything else," I argued. "You cannot fine me for something that was not clearly stated in the rules." Tom, the board member I recognized, spoke up. "Barbara, I have to say, I think Marcus has a point. We have never enforced this kind of thing before. People have snow on their cars, their patio furniture, all sorts of things after a snowstorm. Why are we singling out his boat cover?" Barbara shot Tom a look that could freeze hell. "Because his boat is prominently displayed and visible from the street. It reflects poorly on our community." "That is not what the rule says, though," I pressed. You are making up interpretations that are not actually written down anywhere. Another board member, a woman probably in her 60s, cleared her throat. I agree with Tom. This seems excessive. I move that we waive the fine and provide Mr. Henderson with a warning instead. Second, Tom said immediately. Barbara looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. Fine. All in favor. 3 hands went up, including Tom's and the older woman's. Barbara and one other board member kept their hands down. The motion passes, Barbara said through gritted teeth. The fine is waived. However, Mr. Henderson, consider this your official warning. Any future violations will be enforced strictly. I thanked the board and left the meeting feeling like I had won a small victory, but I could tell from the look on Barbara's face that this was not over. She had been embarrassed in front of the other board members, and women like Barbara do not forget that kind of thing. I was right. Over the next several weeks, I started noticing Barbara driving slowly past my house at weird times. She was looking for something, anything, to nail me with. I made sure my lawn was perfect, my trash cans were stored properly, and everything was by the book. Then we got another snowstorm in late February. This one was bigger, about a foot of snow, and once again my boat cover ended up with a nice pile of white powder on top. I knew exactly what was coming. Sure enough, within hours of the snow stopping, my doorbell rang. Barbara stood there with her clipboard, looking triumphant. Mr. Henderson, I see your boat cover is once again covered in snow. As per your official warning, you have 48 hours to remove it or face fines. Barbara, this is harassment, I said. The snow just stopped falling 2 hours ago. I have not even finished shoveling my driveway. 48 hours, she repeated. The clock is ticking. She walked away and I stood there fuming. I called Derek again. She is targeting you, man, Derek said. This is textbook harassment, but the problem is HOAs have a lot of power. They can make your life miserable if they want to. You could fight it, but it will cost you time and probably legal fees. So what am I supposed to do? Just let her push me around? You could sell and move, Derek suggested. Or you could comply and not give her any ammunition. Or, he paused, you could get creative. What do you mean? Well, she is mad about your boat being visible and having snow on it, right? What if it was still visible, but in a way that bothered her more than it bothered you? I liked the way Derek thought. I spent that evening researching the HOA bylaws again, this time reading every single word of every single rule. I was looking for loopholes, for anything that gave me leverage, and then I found it. Section 8 covered parking and vehicle placement. It stated that boats and RVs could be parked on properties as long as they were not blocking the street or sidewalk, and were positioned on improved surfaces like driveways or concrete pads. There was no rule about where on your property the boat had to be, just that it had to be on your property and not blocking public access. My property had something that most others in the neighborhood did not. Because I was on a corner lot, I had a side yard that faced the main street running through our development, and that side yard happened to face directly toward the row of houses on the opposite side of the street. One of those houses was Barbara's. I smiled. This was going to be beautiful. The next morning, I went out and cleared the snow off my boat cover, making sure to document it with photos showing that I was in compliance within the 48-hour window. Then I hooked my truck up to the boat trailer and carefully moved the entire rig from the side of my house, where it had been parked for 3 years. I repositioned it on the concrete pad in my side yard, perfectly legal according to the bylaws, but now positioned so that it was directly facing Barbara's house across the street. Her house had these big, beautiful windows in the front that I knew she was proud of, because I had heard her bragging about them at some neighborhood gathering. Those windows probably gave her a lovely view of the mountains in the distance. But now, they gave her a lovely view of my boat. I made sure everything was perfect. The boat was completely on my property, on an improved surface, not blocking any public access. It was 100% within the rules. I even measured the distance from the curb to make sure I was not encroaching on any easements. Then I went inside and waited. It took less than an hour. My doorbell rang so hard I thought Barbara might break the button. I opened the door to find her red-faced and shaking with anger. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she shouted. "I am sorry, what?" I asked innocently. "Your boat, you moved it. It is blocking my view." "Is it on my property?" I asked calmly. "That is not the point." "Actually, that is exactly the point. According to Section 8 of the HOA bylaws, I am allowed to park my boat on my property as long as it is on an improved surface and not blocking public access. I am in full compliance. You moved it just to spite me." "I moved it because you have been harassing me about snow on the cover. This position gets more sun, so the snow melts faster. I am just trying to stay in compliance with your rules, Barbara." She was so angry she could barely speak. This is unacceptable. I will have the board review this." "You do that," I said pleasantly. "Have a great day." She stormed off and I closed the door, grinning from ear to ear. I immediately texted Derek to tell him what I had done. "Dude, that is amazing," he texted back. "But be careful. She's going to come after you hard now." He was right. Over the next week, I received 3 more violation notices. One claimed that my mailbox was not properly maintained because there was a small scratch on it. Another said that my house numbers were faded and needed to be replaced. The third claimed that I had weeds in my lawn. I took photos documenting that all of these claims were either completely false or so minor that they had never been enforced against anyone else in the neighborhood. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Barbara, every violation notice, and every time I saw her driving past my house. I also started attending HOA meetings regularly, which seemed to annoy her to no end. At the March meeting, Barbara brought up my boat placement as a discussion item. "We need to address the issue of recreational vehicle placement," she announced. "Specifically, boats and RVs that are positioned in a way that negatively impacts neighboring properties." Tom immediately jumped in. "What negative impact? Marcus has his boat on his property, legally parked according to our bylaws. What is the issue?" "The issue is that it is obstructing views and creating an eyesore," Barbara snapped. "An eyesore," I said from my seat in the audience. "It is a boat. A well-maintained boat on a proper cover. It is not like I have a broken-down car on blocks." The older woman board member, whose name I had learned was Margaret, nodded. "I have to agree with Marcus. If the boat is in compliance with our current rules, we cannot penalize him for it. If the board wants to change the rules about boat placement, that would require a vote and proper notice to all residents." Barbara looked around the table and realized she did not have the support. "Fine," she said tightly. "But I am putting forth a motion to amend Section 8 to include provisions about recreational vehicle placement that takes into account sight lines and aesthetic impact on neighboring properties. That motion will require a full vote of the community," Tom said. "You will need to send out the proposed amendment and hold a special meeting." Barbara clearly had not thought this through. Changing HOA bylaws required a majority vote of all homeowners, not just the board. And I was betting that most of my neighbors did not care enough about where I parked my boat to bother voting on it. The meeting ended with Barbara promising to draft the proposed amendment and send it out for consideration. I left feeling pretty good about my chances. Over the next few weeks, Spring started arriving in Colorado Springs. The weather got warmer, the snow melted completely, and I started getting my boat ready for fishing season. I would go out to my side yard and work on it in plain view, making sure everything was in perfect condition. Every time I was out there, I could see Barbara peering through her windows, watching me with barely concealed rage. The proposed bylaw amendment arrived in my mailbox in early April. It was laughably specific, clearly written with the sole purpose of targeting my boat. The amendment would require that all recreational vehicles be parked in positions that minimize visual impact on neighboring properties, and be positioned at least 50 feet from any property line facing a public street. The 50-foot requirement was the kicker. Because of the dimensions of my corner lot, there was literally no place on my property that was 50 feet from all street-facing property lines. The amendment would effectively ban me from parking my boat at my house at all. I was not about to let that happen. I started talking to my neighbors, explaining the situation, and showing them how ridiculous this amendment was. Most of them were sympathetic, especially when I pointed out that if the HOA could arbitrarily create rules to target one person, they could do it to anyone. My neighbor to the left, a guy named Kevin who was about my age and also had a boat, was particularly supportive. "This is bull," he said when I showed him the proposed amendment. "If this passes, it would affect me too. My boat would not meet that 50-foot requirement either." "Exactly," I said. "This is not about community standards. This is about Barbara being petty and vindictive because I stood up to her." Kevin promised to vote against the amendment and to talk to other neighbors. I did the same, knocking on doors and having conversations. I found out that Barbara was not particularly popular in the community. A lot of people thought she was too aggressive and too focused on nitpicky violations instead of actual community improvement. The special meeting for the bylaw amendment was scheduled for late April. The turnout was much bigger than the normal monthly meetings. The community center was packed with at least 50 residents, which was probably a third of the entire neighborhood. Barbara presented the amendment, giving a long speech about maintaining property values and community aesthetics. She carefully avoided mentioning me by name, but everyone knew this was directed at my boat. When she finished, the floor was opened for discussion. Tom spoke first. "I have lived in this community for 12 years, he said. "And in that time, I have never seen the board propose an amendment that was so clearly targeted at one specific resident. This is not about community standards. This is personal, and we all know it." Several people murmured in agreement. Margaret spoke next. "I also have concerns about the precedent this sets. If we allow the board to create hyper-specific rules to target individual residents, where does it end? What if the board decides they do not like someone's car or their fence or their landscaping? We cannot govern based on personal vendettas." More people voiced their support for that position. A few people spoke in favor of the amendment, mostly Barbara's friends who probably felt obligated to support her. But the majority sentiment in the room was clear. When it came time to vote, the amendment failed spectacularly. Out of the 53 residents present, only 12 voted in favor. 41 voted against. Barbara looked absolutely devastated. Her face went from red to pale, and she gathered her papers and left the meeting before it was even officially adjourned. I felt a little bad for her, but only a little. She had brought this on herself by being so vindictive and petty. I thought that would be the end of it. The amendment was defeated, my boat was staying put, and Barbara had been publicly humiliated. Surely she would back off now. But I had underestimated just how obsessed Barbara had become with this situation. In May, I noticed something strange. I came home from work one evening, to find that someone had spray-painted graffiti on my boat cover. It was just random scribbles and a few curse words, nothing creative, but it was definitely vandalism. I immediately called the police and filed a report. The officer who responded was sympathetic but realistic. "Without any witnesses or security footage, there is not much we can do," he explained. "You could try setting up cameras in case it happens again." I took his advice and installed security cameras covering my driveway and side yard. The cameras were motion-activated and saved footage to the cloud. I also ordered a new boat cover to replace the vandalized one. 2 weeks later, my cameras caught something. At 2 in the morning, a figure dressed in dark clothing approached my boat and appeared to be tampering with it. The footage was not clear enough to identify the person definitively, but I could tell it was a woman based on the body's shape and size. I checked my boat the next morning and found that someone had tried to slash the new cover with a knife. They had not succeeded in doing much damage because the cover was made of thick, durable material, but the intent was clear. Someone was escalating from petty harassment to actual property damage. I took the footage to the police station and filed another report. This time, the officer took it more seriously. "You have any idea who might be targeting you?" he asked. I explained the whole situation with Barbara and the HOA dispute. The officer raised his eyebrows. "That is quite a conflict. But you are saying you think the HOA president is vandalizing your property." "I do not have proof that it is her specifically," I admitted. "But the timing is awfully suspicious. And look at the size and build of the person in the footage. It could definitely be her." "We will look into it," the officer promised. "In the meantime, keep your cameras running and document everything." I also sent a formal complaint to the HOA board, copying all the members, describing the vandalism and my suspicions. I carefully worded it to avoid directly accusing Barbara without evidence, but I made it clear that I believed the vandalism was related to the ongoing dispute. Tom called me the next day. "Marcus, I got your email. This is getting out of hand. I am going to request an emergency board meeting to discuss this situation." The emergency meeting was held 3 days later. This time, Barbara looked nervous rather than angry. Tom started the meeting by addressing the elephant in the room. "We have a serious problem," he said. "One of our residents has been the victim of repeated vandalism, and there is reason to believe it may be connected to HOA disputes. This is completely unacceptable. If anyone on this board or in this community is engaging in this behavior, it needs to stop immediately." Barbara spoke up defensively. "Are you accusing me of something, Tom?" "I am not accusing anyone specifically," Tom said carefully. "But we all know there has been an ongoing conflict between you and Marcus Henderson, and the timing of this vandalism is suspicious." "That is ridiculous," Barbara said. "I would never vandalize someone's property. This is insulting." Margaret intervened. "No one is making accusations, Barbara. But we do need to address the broader issue. The conflict between you and Mr. Henderson has gotten out of control. You have issued multiple violation notices that the board has found to be excessive or unfounded. You proposed a bylaw amendment that was clearly targeted at one resident. This needs to stop." "I am enforcing the rules," Barbara insisted. "That is my job as HOA president." "No," Tom said firmly. "Your job is to enforce the rules fairly and equally across all residents. What you have been doing is harassment, and I think it is time for you to step down as president." The room went silent. Barbara looked shocked. "You cannot remove me," she said. "I was elected." "You are right," Tom acknowledged. "We cannot remove you without cause, but we can call for a vote of no confidence and hold a special election." And based on how the bylaw amendment vote went, I do not think you would win re-election." Barbara stood up abruptly. "This is absurd. I have dedicated countless hours to this community, and this is how you treat me. Fine. If you want me gone so badly, I will save you the trouble. I resign." She grabbed her things and walked out. The remaining board members looked at each other in surprise. "Well," Margaret said, "I guess that solves that problem." Tom was elected as the new HOA president at the next regular meeting. He immediately reached out to me to apologize for everything that had happened and to assure me that the harassment would stop. But the vandalism did not stop. In fact, it got worse. In June, I woke up one morning to find that all 4 tires on my boat trailer had been slashed. The security footage showed the same figure in dark clothing, this time carrying what looked like a large knife or machete. The person was also more careful about avoiding the camera angles, keeping their face hidden. I was done playing nice. I took the footage to the police again and demanded that they do something. This time, I also brought copies of all the violation notices, the failed bylaw amendment, and documentation of the entire conflict with Barbara. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Detective Sarah Chen, reviewed everything carefully. "This is definitely harassment," she said. "And with the escalating property damage, we are taking this seriously. The problem is we still cannot definitively identify the person in the footage." "Do you have any other evidence that points to Barbara Whitmore specifically?" "Not yet," I admitted, "but I am working on it. I decided to upgrade my security system. I installed additional cameras with better night vision and higher resolution. I also installed motion sensor lights that would illuminate my entire side yard if anyone approached." Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood had gotten a lot better without Barbara running the HOA. Tom was doing a great job as president, focusing on actual community improvements like fixing the playground equipment and organizing neighborhood events. The petty violation notices stopped, and people seemed happier overall. But I still had this vandalism problem hanging over me. I was spending a fortune on boat repairs, and I was constantly on edge, wondering when the next attack would come. Then, in early July, I got the break I needed. My cameras caught the vandal in action again, this time trying to pour something on my boat cover. The motion lights clicked on, fully illuminating the side yard. The person panicked and ran, but not before the camera got a clear shot of their face. It was Barbara. I immediately downloaded the footage and drove to the police station. Detective Chen reviewed it carefully. "That is definitely clear enough for identification," she said. "I will get a warrant for her arrest." 2 days later, Barbara was arrested at her home and charged with multiple counts of criminal mischief and vandalism. The local news picked up the story, running a headline about an HOA president arrested for vandalizing a resident's property. It was mortifying for Barbara, and honestly, I felt a little bad about that. But she had brought this entirely on herself. The case went to court in September. Barbara's lawyer tried to argue that she had been under stress and that the conflict with me had caused her to have a mental breakdown. The prosecutor was not buying it. "Miss Whitmore did not have a breakdown," the prosecutor argued. "She engaged in a calculated campaign of harassment and vandalism because she was angry that Mr. Henderson stood up to her abuse of power. She vandalized his property on multiple occasions, causing thousands of dollars in damages. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate and sustained criminal behavior." The judge agreed. Barbara was found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended to probation, plus restitution for all the damages to my boat and community service. She was also required to attend anger management counseling. She and her husband put their house up for sale shortly after the sentencing. I saw the moving truck outside her place in late October. Part of me felt bad about how everything had turned out, but a bigger part of me felt vindicated. She had tried to bully me, and when that did not work, she had resorted to breaking the law. She deserved what she got, with Barbara gone and Tom running the HOA like a reasonable human being. Life in Pineview Ridge became what it should have been all along: peaceful. I moved my boat back to its original position on the side of my house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. It had served its purpose in the side yard, but I liked having it back where it had always been. That November, Tom organized a neighborhood Thanksgiving potluck. It was the first community event I had actually wanted to attend since moving in. I brought my famous smoked brisket, and people actually seemed happy to see me. Several neighbors came up to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Barbara's behavior. "We all knew she was being unreasonable," Kevin told me, "but most of us just kept our heads down and tried not to attract her attention. You were brave enough to stand up to her." "I do not know about brave," I said. "I was just stubborn and annoyed." Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, patted my arm. "Sometimes being stubborn is exactly what is needed. You did a good thing, Marcus. This neighborhood is better because of what you did." As I looked around at my neighbors laughing and talking, sharing food and stories, I realized she was right. The neighborhood was better. Tom was already making positive changes, like starting a community garden and organizing a neighborhood watch that actually made sense, instead of just being an excuse to spy on people. December rolled around, and we got our first significant snowfall of the season. About 6 inches overnight, covering everything in a beautiful white blanket. I woke up, made my coffee, and looked out at my boat. The cover was piled with snow, just like it had been a year ago when this whole mess started. I smiled, sipping my coffee. The snow could sit there as long as it wanted. I would get to it when I got to it, or it would melt on its own. Either way, I knew no one was going to show up at my door with a clipboard and a bad attitude. I spent that morning helping Mrs. Patterson again, then clearing my own driveway. By the time I finished, a few other neighbors were out doing the same. Kevin waved from across the street. "Hey, Marcus, your boat cover is looking a little snowy," he called out, grinning. "I know," I shouted back. "Going to get right on that in about 3 days when it melts," he laughed. "Sounds like a plan." That afternoon, I decided to do something I had been putting off. I wrote a letter to the entire HOA board, thanking them for their support during the conflict with Barbara, and suggesting some ideas for improving community relations going forward. I proposed creating a clearer process for violation notices that included multiple warnings before fines, and requiring that any new bylaw amendments be reviewed by an independent attorney to ensure they were not overly targeted or unreasonable. Tom loved the ideas. At the December HOA meeting, the board voted to implement both suggestions. They also voted to update the bylaws to clarify the snow removal rule, specifically stating that snow on boat covers and other recreational equipment covers did not need to be removed unless it posed a safety hazard or was clearly causing damage to the equipment. "I want to thank Marcus Henderson," Tom said at the meeting, looking directly at me, "for having the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was not easy. His actions led to positive changes in our community, and we are all better for it." The room applauded. I felt my face getting red, but I was also genuinely touched. A year ago, I had been the neighborhood villain. Now I was being thanked for improving the community. It was a strange turnaround. As winter settled in and the holidays approached, I found myself actually enjoying living in Pineview Ridge for the first time since I had moved in. I had friends in the neighborhood now. People waved when I drove by. Kevin and I started planning fishing trips for the spring. On Christmas Eve, I was hanging lights on my house when a car pulled up. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought it might be Barbara back to cause more trouble. But it was Tom, holding a wrapped package. "Hey, Marcus," he said, getting out of his car. "I wanted to drop this by as a thank you from the board." I opened the package to find a nice engraved plaque that read, "To Marcus Henderson, for outstanding service to the Pineview Ridge community. Your dedication to fairness and justice has made our neighborhood a better place." "Tom, this is way too much," I said. "No, it is not," he said firmly. "What you went through was awful, and you handled it with grace and determination. You could have just moved away or given up, but you stood your ground and made things better for everyone. That deserves recognition." We shook hands, and Tom wished me a Merry Christmas before heading back to his car. I stood there in my front yard, holding the plaque, looking at my house with its Christmas lights, my boat parked peacefully on the side with its clear cover, the mountains in the distance turning pink in the sunset. I had bought this house 3 years ago because it had a nice driveway and was close to the lake. I had never expected to become an accidental HOA reform activist. But sometimes life throws you into battles you did not sign up for, and you just have to decide whether you are going to roll over or fight back. I chose to fight back, and I was glad I did. The new year brought fresh starts all around. Tom continued to do an excellent job as HOA president, focusing on community building rather than petty enforcement. The neighborhood seemed happier, more relaxed. People actually talked to each other now instead of just nervously avoiding eye contact and hurrying into their houses. In February, we got another big snowstorm, probably 10 inches this time. And yes, my boat cover was once again piled high with snow. I left it there for 4 days until it melted naturally in the warm afternoon sun. Not a single person said a word about it. I took my boat out for the first time that spring on a beautiful April morning. Kevin came with me, and we spent the day on Lake Pueblo, catching bass and talking about nothing important. It was perfect. "You know," Kevin said as we were packing up to head home, "I am really glad you did not move away. This neighborhood was kind of miserable before you took on Barbara. Now it actually feels like a community." "I am glad I stayed too," I said, even though it was a pain in the neck at the time. "The best things usually are," Kevin said wisely. When I got home that evening and pulled into my driveway, I saw Mrs. Patterson sitting on her porch. She waved me over. "How was the fishing?" she asked. "Great, caught some nice bass. Want some fish? I have way more than I can eat." Her face lit up. "Oh, that would be wonderful. You know, Marcus, I am so glad you live here. You are a good neighbor and a good man." I thanked her and brought over some of the cleaned fish. As I walked back to my house, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year and a half. The absurd violation notice about snow on my boat cover, moving the boat to block Barbara's view, the escalating harassment and vandalism, the police investigation, the trial, Barbara's conviction and departure from the neighborhood, the reforms to the HOA rules and procedures. It had been exhausting and frustrating and expensive, but it had also been strangely satisfying. I had stood up to a bully, refused to back down, and ultimately won. More importantly, I had made life better not just for myself but for my entire neighborhood. As I settled onto my couch that evening, tired but content, I realized that this was what home should feel like. Not just a house you own, but a place where you belong, where you are respected, where you can park your boat wherever the hell you want as long as it is on your property and following reasonable rules. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Hey man, how is life in the HOA war zone?" I smiled and typed back, "Peaceful, really peaceful, I won." "Hell yeah, you did," he replied. "Proud of you, buddy." I was proud of myself, too. Not many people are willing to take on an abusive HOA president and see it through to the end. It would have been easier to just comply, to clear the snow off my boat cover immediately every time it snowed, to park my boat somewhere less visible, to avoid confrontation. But easier is not always better. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it is hard, even when it is uncomfortable, even when you risk becoming the neighborhood pariah. Because if you do not stand up to bullies, they just keep bullying, and the next person might not be as stubborn or as willing to fight back. That summer, the HOA organized a neighborhood block party. It was a huge success, with probably 80% of the residents showing up. There was a bouncy house for kids, a barbecue competition that I entered with my smoked ribs, and even a dunk tank where people could pay to try to dunk the board members for charity. Tom got dunked about 20 times. He was a good sport about it. As I stood there eating potato salad and watching kids play, surrounded by neighbors who were laughing and having a good time, I thought about how different this scene would have been if Barbara were still in charge. There would have been 1,000 rules about where people could set up their food tables, what kind of music was allowed, what time everyone had to leave. She would have been walking around with her clipboard, looking for violations, making everyone nervous. Instead, we had Tom, who was currently soaking wet from the dunk tank and loving every minute of it. We had a community that felt like an actual community instead of a prison camp run by a petty tyrant. "Great ribs," Margaret said, coming up beside me with a plate. She had joined the HOA board after Barbara left and had been instrumental in pushing through the reforms I had suggested. "Thanks," I said. "Your coleslaw is amazing." "Old family recipe," she said with a smile. Then her expression turned more serious. "You know, Marcus, I owe you an apology. I was on the board when Barbara was targeting you, and while I tried to push back against her worst impulses, I should have done more. I should have spoken up louder." "You did speak up," I reminded her. "You voted to waive that first fine. You opposed the bylaw amendment. You called out the harassment at the emergency meeting." "But I could have done more," she insisted. "I could have called for her resignation earlier. I could have been more forceful. I let her get away with too much for too long because I did not want to rock the boat." I understood that instinct. Most people avoid confrontation if they can. It is human nature. "Well, you are definitely making up for it now," I said. "The work you and Tom have done to reform the HOA has been incredible. This neighborhood is completely different," she smiled. "We have had good suggestions to work with. Your ideas about the violation process and bylaw review have made a huge difference." As the afternoon wore on and the block party continued, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey. It had started with something so ridiculously petty: snow on a boat cover. 8 inches of snow that would have melted on its own in a couple of days. That was all it took for Barbara to decide I was her enemy. But that small act of petty tyranny had revealed something bigger. It had exposed the fact that our HOA was being run by someone who cared more about power and control than about actually serving the community. And while my boat became the focal point of the conflict, the real issue was always about how much authority an HOA should have over people's lives and property. I had not set out to be some kind of HOA reform activist. I just wanted to be left alone to live in my house and park my boat on my own property. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone, whether you intend to or not. As the sun started setting and the block party began winding down, Tom came over, still damp from the dunk tank. "Hell of a party," he said. "Best one we have had," I agreed. "You know, we have elections coming up in November," Tom said. "I was hoping you might consider running for the board." "We could use someone like you," I laughed. "After everything I went through with this HOA, you want me to join it?" "Exactly because of everything you went through," Tom said seriously. "You understand why these rules matter and why they should be enforced fairly. You are not going to let power go to your head, and people respect you. You would be great." I told him I would think about it, which was not a no. The truth was, I had developed a weird appreciation for HOA governance through this whole experience. When done right, an HOA really could make a neighborhood better. It could maintain property values, organize community events, handle common area maintenance. The problem was not the concept of an HOA. The problem was people like Barbara who used it as a personal fiefdom. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Tom's offer. A year and a half ago, I would have laughed at the idea of joining the HOA board. I had hated the HOA with a passion. But now, having seen what a difference good leadership could make, I was actually intrigued. I decided to run. The election was in November, and I won easily. Turns out that being the guy who took down a corrupt HOA president and reformed the organization made you pretty popular with voters. Who knew? My first board meeting was surreal. I was sitting at that same table where Barbara used to sit, where she had refused to waive my fine and tried to push through her ridiculous boat placement amendment. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Tom ran the meetings efficiently and fairly. Margaret was always prepared with detailed financial reports. The other board members, including me, actually worked together instead of just rubber stamping whatever the president wanted. We spent my first meeting discussing legitimate community issues, repairing the playground equipment, budgeting for holiday decorations, planning the spring landscaping for common areas. Not a single petty violation notice was discussed. It was boring in the best possible way. Over the next year, I helped implement even more reforms. We created an appeals process for violation notices that required a hearing before the full board before any fines could be imposed. We established guidelines for what constituted a legitimate violation versus normal wear and tear or minor aesthetic issues. We even created a community newsletter to keep residents informed about HOA activities and decisions. The neighborhood thrived. Property values went up. People were proud to live in Pineview Ridge instead of resentful. We had the lowest HOA turnover rate in Colorado Springs. And through it all, my boat sat peacefully on the side of my house, under its cover, accumulating snow in the winter and staying pristine in the summer. No one ever mentioned it again. 2 years after the whole thing started, I was at another neighborhood barbecue when a new resident approached me. She had just bought the house 4 doors down and was still learning everyone's names. "You are Marcus, right?" she asked. "I heard you have some kind of interesting history with the HOA here." Kevin, who was standing nearby, laughed. "Oh, you need to hear this story." So I told her the whole thing. The snow on the boat cover, Barbara's ridiculous violation notice, moving the boat to block her view, the escalating harassment and vandalism, the arrest and trial, the reforms. She listened with growing amazement. "That is incredible," she said when I finished. "You basically saved this neighborhood from a tyrant." "I do not know about that," I said modestly. "I just refuse to let someone push me around over something stupid." "That is exactly what saving a neighborhood from a tyrant means," she pointed out. Maybe she was right. All I knew was that I had fought for what was fair and reasonable, and I had won. And now I got to help make sure that no one else in Pineview Ridge would ever have to go through what I went through. It was a good feeling. That winter, we got the biggest snowstorm Colorado Springs had seen in a decade. 18 inches in one night. Everything was buried. And yes, my boat cover had a massive pile of snow on it. I left it there for a week. Not because I was being defiant, but because I was busy helping elderly neighbors shovel their driveways and making sure everyone was safe. The snow on my boat cover was the absolute lowest priority, as it should be. When I finally got around to clearing it off, Kevin came over to help. We were out there with brooms and shovels, laughing about how this was where the whole crazy story had started. You know what the funny thing is? Kevin said, if Barbara had just left you alone about that first little bit of snow, none of this would have happened. She would probably still be HOA president, still making everyone miserable, but at least she would not have a criminal record. Pride comes before a fall, I said. Or in this case, before a criminal conviction for vandalism. We finished clearing the snow, and I stood back to admire my boat. It had been the innocent victim in all of this, just sitting there existing while two humans had a ridiculous conflict around it. But it had also been the catalyst for positive change in the entire neighborhood. Best boat in Colorado, Kevin declared. Damn right, I agreed. That evening I got an email from Tom. He was stepping down as HOA president to focus on his grandkids, and was recommending that the board elect me as his replacement. I read the email 3 times, trying to decide how I felt about it. Being HOA president was a lot of work and responsibility. It was also a position that could easily corrupt someone, as we had all learned from Barbara. But I also knew that I would never abuse that power the way she had. I had been on the receiving end of HOA tyranny, and I would never inflict that on anyone else. If I became president, I would run the HOA the way it should be run. Fairly, transparently, and with the goal of actually serving the community rather than controlling it. I typed out my response. I would be honored. The board voted unanimously to elect me as the new HOA president at the January meeting. It was simultaneously the last thing I had expected when I first moved to Pineview Ridge, and the most natural progression of events. In my first speech as president, I talked about what I had learned over the past 3 years. An HOA should serve its residents, not rule over them, I said. Rules should be clear, fair, and enforced equally. And most importantly, we need to remember that we are all neighbors first and board members second. Our goal is to create a community where people want to live, not a bureaucratic nightmare where everyone is afraid of getting fined for having snow on their boat cover. People laughed at that last part, but they also nodded seriously. They got it. They had lived through the bad old days of Barbara's reign, and they did not want to go back to that. Under my leadership, the HOA continued to improve. We started scholarship funds for neighborhood kids, organized quarterly community events, and even negotiated better rates for common area maintenance by getting competitive bids from multiple contractors. The most satisfying moment came 2 years into my presidency when a resident came to a board meeting with a complaint. He had received a violation notice about his fence being half an inch too tall according to the bylaws. I measured it myself, he said. It is exactly 6 feet tall, which is what the bylaws say. But the notice claims it is 6 feet and half an inch. I do not understand why this matters. I looked at the violation notice and saw that it had been issued by our community manager, a new woman named Patricia who had been hired a few months earlier. I made a note to have a conversation with her about what constituted a reasonable violation. Sir, I am going to void this violation notice right now, I said. Half an inch on a 6-foot fence is well within normal measurement variance and is not a legitimate violation. I apologize that you received this notice in the first place. The relief on his face was visible. Thank you. I was worried I was going to have to rebuild my entire fence or pay a huge fine. Not happening, I assured him. That is exactly the kind of nitpicky enforcement we have worked hard to eliminate from this HOA. After the meeting, I had a frank conversation with Patricia about enforcement priorities and reasonable standards. I explained the history of the neighborhood and why we were so careful about not abusing the violation process. I understand, she said. I came from a different HOA where they were very strict about measurements. I will recalibrate my approach. I appreciate that, I said. Remember, our job is to maintain community standards, not to harass people over trivial issues. If you are not sure whether something is worth a violation notice, err on the side of giving people the benefit of the doubt. She nodded, and true to her word, she adjusted her approach. We never had another complaint about unreasonable violation notices during her tenure. 5 years after the snow on the boat cover incident started, Pineview Ridge was named one of the best managed HOA communities in Colorado by a state homeowners association group. We received the award for our fair enforcement policies, strong community engagement, and transparent governance. At the awards ceremony, I give a speech about how the community had transformed from a place of petty tyranny to a genuinely great place to live. I did not mention Barbara by name, but everyone who had lived through that era knew who I was talking about. Change often starts with small acts of resistance, I said. Someone refusing to accept unfair treatment. Someone standing up and saying this is not right. In our case, it started with a disagreement about snow on a boat cover. That sounds ridiculous, and in many ways it was. But that small conflict revealed bigger problems, and fixing those problems made our entire community better. The audience applauded. After the ceremony, several people from other HOAs came up to ask me for advice on how to reform their own communities. Start with the bylaws, I told them. Make sure the rules are clear, specific, and reasonable. Create an appeals process so residents have recourse against unfair enforcement. And most importantly, remember that an HOA exists to serve the community, not to control it. It was advice I wished someone had given Barbara years ago. Maybe if she had understood that basic principle, she would not have ended up with a criminal record and forced out of her home in disgrace. But some people are so addicted to power and control that they cannot see reason until it is too late. Barbara had been one of those people. I was determined to never become one myself. As my term as HOA president continued, I made it a point to regularly walk around the neighborhood and talk to residents. I wanted to know what people cared about, what concerned them, what they wanted to see improved. I did not want to become isolated up on the board, making decisions without understanding how they affected real people. During one of these walks, I ran into Mrs. Patterson, now in her mid-80s but still sharp as a tack. "Marcus, dear, you have done such wonderful work with the HOA," she said. "This neighborhood is like night and day compared to when that awful woman was in charge." "Thanks, Mrs. Patterson. I just try to treat people fairly." "That is exactly what we needed," she said. "Someone who remembers what it was like to be bullied by the HOA and refuses to let it happen to anyone else." She was right. That experience with Barbara had fundamentally shaped how I approached HOA governance. Every time I reviewed a violation notice or considered a new rule, I asked myself, is this fair? Is this reasonable? Would I accept this if it were directed at me? If the answer to any of those questions was no, I did not move forward with it. That philosophy served the neighborhood well. Over my years as president, we had the lowest rate of complaints and disputes of any HOA in the region. People actually liked their HOA, which is apparently a rare thing. My boat, meanwhile, continued to sit peacefully on the side of my house, a silent monument to the battle that had changed everything. I took excellent care of it, and it took me on countless fishing trips over the years. Every time I looked at it, I remembered where this all started and how far we had come. Eventually, after serving 6 years as HOA president, I decided it was time to step down and let someone else take over. The neighborhood was in excellent shape. The systems and processes we had implemented were running smoothly, and I was ready to have more free time for fishing and other pursuits. At my final meeting as president, the board presented me with another plaque. This one read, Marcus Henderson, HOA President 2023-2029, with gratitude for his dedication to fair governance and community building. You transformed this neighborhood, Margaret said, her voice emotional. You took a bad situation and turned it into something wonderful. We will never forget what you did here. We all did it together, I said. I just made sure we remembered to treat people fairly and with respect. That is not revolutionary. That is just being decent human beings. But apparently, in the world of HOAs, being decent human beings was revolutionary enough. I remained on the board as a regular member for another 2 years before finally retiring from HOA service altogether. By then, the culture of fair enforcement and community focus was so ingrained in Pineview Ridge that I knew it would continue even without my direct involvement. Looking back on the entire journey, from that first ridiculous violation notice to my years serving on the board, I realized that the whole thing had taught me something important about life. Sometimes the battles you never wanted to fight end up being the most important ones. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. And sometimes, snow on a boat cover is not just snow on a boat cover. Sometimes it is the beginning of real change. I still live in Pineview Ridge today, 17 years after I first moved in. My boat is still parked on the side of my house, though I have upgraded to a newer model. The neighborhood is still one of the best managed HOAs in Colorado. And every winter, when the snow falls and covers my boat, I smile and let it sit there for as long as it wants, because I can. Because it is my property, my boat, and my choice. And because I helped build a community where that kind of freedom is respected, not punished. That is the real victory, and it was worth every minute of the fight.